Welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is the first Thursday of the month, November 7th, 2019. We are streaming live from KMUD Community Radio in Humboldt County. I'm Mary Massey with co-host John Sakowicz. This and all programs are archived both here at KMUD and on our show website, heroespatriots.org. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our audiences here in Northern California and hearing live from the web stream throughout the country and throughout the world. Before we get started, and we're going to do a show today on an important trial involving some protesters at Plowshares protesting the deployment of Trident nuclear missiles in Georgia. I want to just take a moment to remember my friend and a friend of the peace movement, John Llewellyn, who passed away earlier this week. John Llewellyn is known in health food circles for wild harvesting seaweed along the Mendocino coast of California for over 40 years. But he's also known among the national and international peace activism movement, especially on reducing threat, confrontation, and avoiding nuclear war. I just wanted to read a quick quote here, if I may, from John's Midsummer Reflections from Wild Seaweed Country 2018. And I quote, "Wisdom begins when a person transcends their own ego, realizing that personal identity is a fiction. We are all cells in a single organism. As this realization unfolds globally, there are only two parties, the fear and division party and the power of love party. And we can only be members of one party or the other, but not both parties. Satyagraha, or love force, is the superior force above all force. Love is the highest law." Rest in peace, my friend, John Llewellyn.
Today's program features two guests, John. In the first half hour, we're going to welcome back Kathy Kelly, who is an American peace activist, pacifist, and author, one of the founding members of Voices in the Wilderness, and currently a co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. And then at the half hour, we will be joined by Art Laffin. Art Laffin has been an organizer, writer, speaker in the faith-based movement for peace and justice for over 20 years. He is currently a member of the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker House of Hospitality in Washington, D.C. Just a reminder, you listeners are welcome to ask guests any questions that you might have related to the topic. 707-929-3911. 707-929-3911. Excuse me, 923-3911. You can also email your questions. We'll read those on the airs if you have some comments. That is heroesandpatriots@gmail.com. So we're going to have a good show today, and we hope you'll stay tuned for the full hour. Kathy Kelly is a peace activist, pacifist, and author. She is one of the founding members of Voices in the Wilderness and currently a co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence, that website, vcnv.org. It's a campaign to end U.S. military and economic warfare. As part of a peace team work in several countries, she has traveled to Iraq more than 20 times, notably remaining in combat zones. She has been arrested more than 60 times at home and abroad, and written of her experiences among targets of U.S. military bombardment and inmates of U.S. prisons. She lives in Chicago, and she has most recently written an article, "Trident is the Crime," and we're going to kick off the show with Kathy Kelly. Kathy, are you with us?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, good. Welcome to the program. I just was mentioning that your most recent article of October 25th, "Trident is the Crime," is going to kick off our show. Could you just explain how you wrote this article, how you were involved personally, and get us started?
And what's the trial about?
Yeah.
Well, the Kings Bay Plowshares 7 took that name because they had gone to a nuclear Navy submarine station on the southern coastline of Georgia, and there they did what's considered a traditional plowshares act. Certainly, Art Lappin on the second half of the show can tell you a great deal about that. He has been one of the people who has participated in many plowshares actions. And the idea is to say that nuclear weapons are such a huge and grave threat to all life on the planet that the development and storage and potential use of these weapons must be exposed and must be protested. And so the Kings Bay plowshares defendants entered into that nuclear naval station, and they did a symbolic disarmament action. And they were brought to trial in Brunswick, Georgia, after, their action was on April 4th of 2018, so it's been a very prolonged experience with one of them, Jesuit priest Steve Kelly, being in the Glynn County Jail throughout that time. He was brought into the courtroom in shackles. And, the judge has been described by some as somebody who was almost like a Pentagon functionary because the rules excluded vital testimony that might have allowed a jury to understand that these 7 were in fact defending the right for the United States people to be part of international law, to be part of a worldwide effort to abolish nuclear weapons. At any rate, they weren't allowed to bring in expert testimony about the illegality of nuclear weapons, nor were they allowed to speak in great detail about why they were motivated to engage in civil resistance, why they believed civil resistance is necessary. And so they were convicted, and they're now facing 18 to 24 months in prison.
Mm-hmm. I was struck by something that our friend Daniel Ellsberg said about the plowshares action in Georgia. And it's a word he coined a word I had never heard before, omnicide. And I'll quote what he said. The ultimate logic of the Trident missile program is omnicide. I believe that the defendants are definitely entitled to the legal defense, among others, of, quote, justification or necessity, that an action that would under other circumstances be illegal can be justified as legal by the reasonable belief that it is necessary to avert a much greater evil, in this case, omnicide, the collateral murder of nearly every human being on Earth in a war in which nuclear missiles aboard the Trident missile submarines are launched. What a wonderful and eloquent way to put it, and what a strong legal argument that the quote unquote illegality of your actions as protesters was superseded by the withdrawal of the United States from the INF Treaty, et cetera, that there were greater evils and there were greater crimes being committed. Well, wonderful theory of defense. Do you care to comment on that?
Well, I think that it's a defense which has been allowed in other countries, and when it's been allowed, people have been acquitted. I'm thinking of trials for very similar types of plowshares actions. The idea comes from the book of Isaiah in Scripture. When shall come the day, O Lord, when they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And in Ireland and in the United Kingdom, people who've engaged in these kinds of actions have been acquitted on all counts because the necessity defense was allowed. So it was very good that Daniel Ellsberg spoke out, and that well over 200 people attended the trial in Brunswick, and that many actions have been developing in the South, and a much sturdier crew and core than had existed before for organizing and outreach is really working so beautifully together. But I think that the mainstream media has paid scant attention to this very, very important trial. And really, we should be putting nuclear weapons on trial. There's so much attention to impeachment concerns, but when we think about some of the gravest threats that we face, I think we have to put nuclear weapons right at the top of the list.
In your article, Kathy, and I'm quoting here, you say, on that day, April 4th, 2018, the group had entered a U.S. Navy submarine base. which is a home port for the Trident nuclear missile fleet. Just one of those nuclear missiles, if launched, would cause 1,825 times more damage than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. What exactly transpired when they got on the base? Could you help our listeners understand what they did wrong or what they did?
They planned for and prayed about this action for 2 years in advance of the action. And when they entered into the base, they went to 3 different parts of the base. And, there were 7 defendants, and so several of them put crime scene tape around an entrance to the base, and others had gone to an area where there's like a papier-mâché replica of the missile, and swung a hammer at that. Very symbolic disarmament in that regard. They poured their own blood, and they hung banners that said what Daniel Ellsberg referred to, that nuclear weapons are equal to omnicide. And they called attention to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's words through banners. And then they prayed. They stayed where they were. They didn't try to avoid arrest, and eventually they were spotted. And I think that probably the base is upset because people were able to enter onto the base, not with any kind of terrorist intention, but the bases would like to think their perimeters are far more secure than they apparently were.
So you were charged with trespassing? What was the criminal charge?
Right.
Well, I should say I was not one of the Kings Bay Plowshares 7. In fact, if I'd realized that you wanted to focus on it, I could have told you how to get in touch with them, which I hope you'll do. But they were charged with trespass. They were charged with damage to property, but the charge that carried the most was conspiracy and sabotage. So they were convicted on all of the counts, and the minimum sentence that they could be sentenced to is 18 months.
But then you say in your article the defendants faced 20 years in prison.
Well, this was before the defendants had then been given the actual sentencing guidelines that the judge is going to operate with. They can do the math in a sense and decide are some charges sentencing going to be concurrent or consecutive, but the minimum right now that they're facing is 18 months.
I see. Your other more recent article that I alluded to was on Camp Bucca and the rise of extremism in Iraq, which I know you have been a lifelong peace activist and have traveled and put yourself in harm's way for decades. Could you talk about Camp Bucca and that article? And as we mentioned, we'll be talking with Art a little bit more about the Plowshares trial. But can you talk about that article and what you experienced? What came out of that?
Well, a very close friend of ours who had been in Iraq with us, Shane Claiborne, had gotten in touch with me and said, hey, didn't you go to that Camp Bucca? This was the morning that he learned that Ali Baghdadi had been apprehended by the United States military and killed.
Right.
And I said, yes, I did go there. And so I went back to my own notes on the 2004 visit. Several of us had gone to Amman, Jordan, to await visas to enter into Iraq. And while we were there, some very young and gravely concerned Palestinian men asked us if we could possibly go to Camp Bucca in the far, far south of Iraq. It was a prison, they said, and they had just been released from that prison, but 5 of their friends were still there. And they described conditions which we found unbelievable. I mean, they said that it was a tent prison. There weren't buildings, and they had to sleep on the desert sands with thin blankets. And it can get quite cold in the desert during some seasons in Iraq. And they were afraid of desert scorpions, and they were forced to march naked in front of U.S. military women. And they tried to point out to U.S. military guards that there were 13-year-olds being molested by other prisoners. Could they do something? And the guards turned away. And they had to beg for their food, hold up their empty bowls, and say things like, I love George Bush, or bark like a dog.
Oh, wow.
Now, the reason this, of course, comes to mind is that Ali Baghdadi was imprisoned both in Camp Bucca and in Abu Ghraib. And some of your younger listeners might not, make an association with Abu Ghraib, but I can tell you Major Garrity in charge of Camp Bucca, who did allow us to go in and see these young prisoners we were wanting to visit. We went down there with the brother of one of them who was a dentist and helped with translation. And it was, decent of her to allow us in. The young prisoners still in the Bucca compound said that they felt so isolated, and they were at least glad that maybe their parents now could find out that where they were. But they corroborated everything the youngsters had told us in Amman, Jordan, before we set forth. And the Major Garrity said to us, look, be glad that these young men are here with us and not in Baghdad. We give them food. We give them blankets. And I thought, well, this is the worst place I'd ever seen in my life. We were spitting flies out of our mouths. It's blazing hot. The sands are greasy and horrible. It's far beyond any, town or city. And later, in November of 2004, I finally understood what Major Garrity, who was in charge of Camp Bucca, meant. The camp, by the way, was named after a firefighter on 9/11, and I remember a Haitian-American soldier said, well, this is what we have to do. Well, it doesn't create security for people in the United States to have networks of prisons like Camp Bucca or Abu Ghraib, where people would recall the pictures of the soldiers from the U.S. themselves, MPs, military police sent out of naked prisoners piled in a pyramid while a U.S. woman held her thumb up and smiled, or a man naked with dogs grabbing at his genitals.
Right, I remember those photos.
Those photos. And so this creates the kind of ground, the fertile ground for people to want revenge and retaliation, as Ali Baghdadi clearly did. And I believe that we can trace the roots of ISIS to not only the prison network, which was horrible, but also the 13 years of economic sanctions, the Desert Storm bombing, the shock and awe bombing, the ineptitude of the occupation, the civil war, the tortures, the disappearances. It's just stunning what has happened to Iraqi people. And we ought not be surprised if a younger generation said, we're going to fight back.
If you, as a party of Americans that went in, you said you were waiting in Jordan or Amman, I guess, for your visa. How are you received? I mean, you're obviously a peace activist. You've been vocal, as has your group.
You're a woman. You're
a woman. How have you been received in this this country, in this area?
Well, initially it was never easy to get visas for groups of U.S. and U.K. people to enter into Iraq. But we did manage to send 70 delegations. And as time went by, I think the authorities began to trust that we weren't working for someone else, that we weren't, trying to make money, that we were earnestly trying to protest United States laws by breaking the economic sanctions. We brought medicines in as often as we could. Now, under a dictatorship, the idea of people breaking laws isn't really looked upon too fondly, but eventually, through many, many visits to the Iraq mission, to the UN, visits with the UN humanitarian coordinators, both Dennis Halliday and Hans von Spenek, who both resigned their posts because they said they couldn't any longer enforce these terrible, horrific, draconian economic sanctions that were killing thousands and thousands of children. Eventually, I think people began to see that we were people who earnestly hated warfare and had no reason to hate Iraqis. And I must say that there was never a home I ever entered into, no matter how poor or, some were well-to-do, but mostly people were very, very poor, where we weren't immediately given hospitality. Sit down, have tea. In the very hot city of Basra in the summertime, people would immediately hand you a towel and send you into their closet where you could pour bowls of water over your head. Sleep on a rooftop, come back when you have more time to stay after you'd already been there for 4 hours.
Wow.
People were incredibly hospitable.
Kathy, I attend a lot of meetings at the Council on Foreign Relations, and we've interviewed people on this and other stations like Matthew Ho, who was in part in charge of the State Department's reconstruction effort in Afghanistan, Peter Van Buren, who had the same job for the State Department in Iraq, General McChrystal, who was in charge of our troops in Afghanistan, and they all say the same thing, that the United States, in their very presence as an occupying military force, as an imperial force, looking literally to colonize great parts of the Middle East, and to do so in very repressive ways in the prisons and with human rights violations, etc., literally incubates the next generation of insurgents. We grow our own enemies. We have in all of our excesses and in our lust for war and our lust for oil, we literally incubate the next generation of ISIS or the Taliban or Hamas or Hezbollah, etc. Why isn't this obvious to Congress? Why isn't this obvious to the people who really make war in Washington?
Well, I think that the people who make war in Washington and the Congress people are deeply influenced and, in a sense, almost shaped by the strongest lobby in the United States, and that is the military-industrial corporations. Even though, we might say, well, why in the world would we want to incubate the conditions that would create more terrorists? I mean, this is silly. But if you think about it from the perspective of Boeing or Lockheed Martin or General Electric or Raytheon, your product is not going to be consumed if there's not a war. So ISIS is good for business if you are in the business of manufacturing weapons and selling weapons. And this is a terrible reality because this extremely powerful lobby, I think, also has a great deal of influence on the media in the United States. And so notice in the debates for the Democratic nominee for the presidency, not a single candidate voted against the version of a military budget that was put before the Congress or the Senate. Not one.
Exactly.
And very seldom did the matter of military spending come up, but there's no rational discussion to be had about how to solve the gravest problems we face right now. And that isn't ISIS. It's about the terror of what we're doing to our own environment. God bless Greta Thunberg for trying to clarify the very frightening realities her generation will face. There's no way we can rationally discuss how to deal with that problem or with mass incarceration or with immigration unless we dismantle the demonic suction tube. That's how Reverend Dr. King described it, of United States military spending. That's where the resources and the ingenuity and the inventiveness and the creativity and many of the scientific minds are drawn. And
I'm sorry, Kathy. We have about 2 minutes or so with you.
I have to jump in. I had never heard that expression.
Right.
The demonic suction tube that sucks wealth, resources, technology, human life, away from what is good towards what is evil. I love that.
Could you let our listeners know how they might support your efforts, become involved either at the grassroots or monetarily, and let them know how they might do so in these last remaining minutes?
Oh, thank you. We try to keep people abreast of our thoughts through the website. We have vcnv.org. And right now we have really tried to be good companions to the Kings Bay Plowshares. And the Kings Bay Plowshares website is kingsbayplowshares7.org. And this is a very important time to consider writing letters on behalf of those 7 defendants and to get in touch with that website, and also to write to Steve Kelly, who still remains in the Glynn County Jail. And of course, everybody is in need of funds to keep our work going, and so if people wish to contribute monetarily, they can do so at the Kingsbury Plowshare 7 website, or if they go to Voices, they can write to us at info, at vcnv.org.
Kathy Kelly, thank you so much for joining us for this important information. An American peace activist, pacifist, and author. She is one of the founding members of Voices in the Wilderness and currently a co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. And I might add, she's dedicated her entire life to these efforts. So we were delighted to have you with us, and we do hope that you'll have support coming your way.
Our prayers are with you, Kathy.
Oh, well, thank you. It was a real privilege to be with both of you and with all of your colleagues this morning.